top of the NAPCC structure, right? Because if you look at the way, so yes, I mean, there is the laundry list of all the things India is doing, energy efficiency, EVs, et cetera, goes on. But the main targets are not necessarily fully tied into the NAPCC structure, right? So the NAPCC is essentially a bunch of bureaucratic missions that are quite, I mean, we use the term opportunism in the sense that they're quite opportunistic in picking up like things that will be useful for the ministries. In fact, these are bottom-up things, right? So the ministries essentially say these are things that we're excited about or interested in. It's tagged to the NAPCC, and it just operates on its own. Not all the missions function at the same level of efficiency or success, and they're sort of out there doing their own thing. The whatever little modeling that happens within the MOEF through Terry and all these other guys essentially looks at like the big macro picture. So obviously the amount of solar you add will figure in indirectly into, say, your emissions or including your GDP and so on, but it's not directly a first order sort of correlation between the NAPCC structure, and then from that, what do you get? And then that's the NDC. So it's kind of operating in parallel streams, as far as I understand it.
So, sorry.
Yeah. It's a diplomatic document. I mean, I think it's important to remember that that's a diplomatic document. India tends to separate the diplomatic from the domestic side of it, because India's domestic targets are actually considerably, I mean, especially now, like, 450 gigawatts of renewables and 175 by 2022. These are considerably more advanced than what we pledged in the NDC. So there is that, the international politics side of it filters in. So it's difficult to say it's a technocratic bottom-up built document based on the NAPCC structure. Yeah.
So that actually perfectly relates to the next sort of follow-up that I had to that is, given that what I was always interested in is just, so my mind as a student, before I started studying these processes, I always thought the NDCs would be sort of documents that set goals, sort of an ambitious level that is then to be implemented. What I find interesting in most of the cases, actually, apart from the Chinese case now that I'm studying, it seems to be more like this is what will be achieved. Like, given policies things that are already in place, there's not much, from the insiders, there's never that much of a debate on whether or not the NDC targets will be achieved. And in India's case, they are being surpassed, and domestically the targets are much higher. But what I've also heard, talking to especially some stakeholders from civil society, is that India will unlikely put its current domestic targets that are much more ambitious in an updated NDC either, because it's not entirely sure. They're much more ambitious in the sense that they're not 100% sure they'll be achievable, given other priorities like mainly development. And so given that, anything that gets communicated at an international level can then be scrutinized at that level as well, they'll refrain from putting anything too ambitious in the NDC without being sure that they'll actually be able to achieve that.
Well, I mean, okay, so yes, it is true. I think with the intensity target, that was achieved handily. There was, tons of time left on the clock. I think it was like 2018 or something, sort of made that target. The 40%, 40% was, very clearly non-fossil fuel, which allowed hydropower to be put in. It's about 40 gigawatts, 45 gigawatts right there. And potentially whatever nuclear, though that's not really big on the scene. And then solar, wind, and just regular renewables. So, I mean, in India, you have to remember that hydropower was not a renewable until 2019. Large hydropower, about 25 gigawatts. So, 25 megawatts. Only small hydro below 25 was considered renewable, which is, to my mind, partially why they said non-fossil fuel and made it like an expansive broad category. Mm-hmm. So even there, it's not a stretch target. It's not an ambitious stretch target. The forestry thing befuddles me because I think anybody who was in the space, I'm not particularly clued into forestry, but as far as I understand, it's not necessarily the easiest task to build such a large sink. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really sure what the thinking on the forestry. So the forestry target actually suggests that there's something in the thinking that pushes in the direction of greater ambition rather than completely always lowballing it, right? But this is Paris, and Paris was it was more about the agreement and knitting together this huge multilateral institution. Mm-hmm. This time it's very different in the sense this is a post 1.5 world, and this is post Kerry and Biden and all of that stuff. The EU is thinking about a border carbon adjustment. And so I think this time it's not going to be, it's not going to be just about sort of protecting. I think there is going to be a sense of like, is India going to pledge a slightly more ambitious NDC? Now, all of this is based on how the political pressure translates in the net zero conversation. Every single indication right now is that India will announce a net zero. If it announces a net zero, then it is going to be big in terms of what the next NDC is going to look like. Mm-hmm. I think just at a very base level, it's going to create more pressure on coming out with an NDC, and a lot of scrutiny on what that NDC actually pledges. So I think you could be looking at a very, very different style of NDC and a very different level of ambition, though how much I don't know. Because I think what's going to happen, this is just personal opinion, I have no idea about this, because now we're just speculating about a post-net India net zero world and so on. But I think the way it's going to look is India is going to kind of like China's 5-year plan. Well, I mean, in the sense that we don't have the sectoral plans, but it's not going to be like we're going to, suddenly peak and decline. It's going to be more or less par for course, but more likely to reflect some of the domestic targets and add that stuff in there rather than just sort of really be defensive. Mm-hmm. So some of the 450 gigawatt stuff and so on will be mentioned. Mm-hmm. And those are big, like stretch targets, right? Like those are huge targets. Yeah. So in that sense, I think ambition will start to creep in a little bit, but I don't think the headline targets are going to be like, okay, we're going to decarbonize right now. So they preserve that room, but then signal that, okay, sectorally we're trying to do stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So what I'd be interested in, and maybe just coming back to the process for the INDC, but then also maybe a bit speculative how that might change and how that is currently going for the discussions around net zero, just on a sort of policy integration sort of perspective. Obviously, with the INDC, it seemed that mainly the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change was the sort of convening entity that sort of defined the NDC process. And what I'd heard is that even though there was the Executive Committee on Climate Change and other sort of forums for interministerial exchange, a lot of the time due to turf wars between the ministries, that doesn't, or back then at least, that didn't really function at a high enough level to have much impact. So it was really the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, and then through them afterwards, sort of going on to the President's office that defined the NDC. Would you say that
Prime Minister?
Prime Minister's office, sorry, yeah.
Okay, right. So about the ECCC, you've spoken to someone else about the ECCC, or is this coming primarily from our paper?
It's coming primarily from your paper, and a little bit just, I had sort of assumed that was at the time of the INDC, the forum where sort of interministerial exchange would have taken place.
Okay, so yeah, I was just trying to calibrate whether you had like information that changed what I knew about the ECCC